When something's a year old, we need to get rid of it and buy something else. So this notion of consumerism, there's a gratifying activity that it's going to make us feel better. Just go for a shop, you'll feel better getting your shoes. The possessions are desirable. So these are some of the dominant ideologies that permeate within our current capitalist cultural environment. What I'd like you to do now, because I can't actually present this slide to you, because of copyright issues, etc. What I'd like you to do now is have a look at your slides, and I'm just going to describe what it is. You'll find a slide there which has got Katy Perry sitting in a bit of lycra, crop top, holding 2 big packets of crisps or chips or popcorn or something with the inscription "Love" without the handles. I'd like you to think about what ideology, what discourses are going on there. There's this ideology of love, which we've talked about just briefly. Without the handles, what's that about? You know, is she suggesting that if I just sit in lycra, I can eat as many kind of crisps or pieces of popcorn or whatever it is that she's holding as I like, that I'll stay really slim? And by staying slim, you see, I'll find the love that I need. So there are subtle messages of how to conform, permeated through this text. And if you have a look at the next text down, which I'll describe very briefly, there's a male and a female, both white, both young, both attractive by contemporary standards, and they are in some sort of embrace. And this is obviously ostensibly an advert for some aftershave or some cologne of some sort. And again, the notion and the ideology of romantic love and needing to smell a certain way to get that love, needing to be certain kind of clean shaven, need to look in a certain way, is being permeated there. I suppose the big question is, who is not in this frame? Who is being privileged and who is therefore being deprivileged within that as well? So ideology is being permeated, but a whole series of different ideologies are being permeated there as, again, about who is legitimate in society, who is more legitimate in society. It's rare that you would see older people in that situation, etc. So always think when you're looking at these texts, not just what ideology is being permeated, but who is being represented, who is not being represented. We'll go on to talk about some of these things in tutorials over the next couple of weeks. And then if you have a think about dominant ideology in the media, we consume most of our ideological constructs through media text. They're a very strong form of influence and effect upon us. The media do ideological work. Remember, media outlets are often owned by those who are most powerful in society. So whose stories are they permeating, and which structures of power do they wish to uphold? So they can help, they can mask by not presenting information, by not profiling on the front page the Black Lives Matter movement or the Me Too, #MeToo movement, or the Occupy movement. You know, what stories, what massive groundswell of activity is not being presented through these media texts, as well as what is. So they can help maintain dominant ideology, the status quo in other words. So they mask or displace or avoid certain social issues and problems as if they don't exist, as if they're not important, because they may in fact critique the power structure or some elements of the power structure in which they are privileged. Incorporating and therefore subduing rebellious or radical ideas or movements, so just incorporating them to just a small element of them, but just to dissipate, just to make sure that they're smoothed out, that they're not going to be too rebellious on the outside. Wooing us into absorbing ideology by giving us pleasure, making us laugh at things, making us see the funny side of things, also works. But this concept also suggests that in imposing one-way relationship with the text that we just receive, the ideology, if you like, from the text that we're engaging with, it's actually much more complex than that we obviously read and take into the media construction our own ideological perspectives as well. Media texts can express dominant ideology, but they can also be a space for contradictions and ideological competition and struggle. We can subvert by deconstructing the ideologies as well that we engage with through those texts. So I want you to think as well about how you think technology may have or may be working towards changing who has control. Do you think now that you can upload your own YouTube videos, create your own blogs, establish your own Facebook sites, do you think you have more power now than people who didn't have access to these things 20 years ago? Because if we know that ideology is permeated through these texts, and it was once, only the very, very dominant, the very rich, the very powerful that had control of these, but now you and I, as mere mortals, have control over these things, there's potentially an opportunity for different ideologies to find a broader audience. So there's some argument, if you like, that there's a democratization of media through the new technologies that we have access to. I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about hegemony and give you some examples of that as well, and maybe some examples of counter-hegemony too. So bear with me because I'm going to do a little bit of reading here. Hegemony: the ways in which dominant groups obtain and maintain power and legitimacy is through a struggle or negotiation over ideas, meanings and representations. Subordinate groups, these are groups that are the less powerful, if you like, submit to domination by accepting as natural the values, control and influence of dominant groups. Hegemony refers to the ruling social group having power and authority. However, it also involves why and how the less powerful groups accept their domination. So hegemony is this notion of powerful kind of persuasion and then acceptance by others of the truth of that ideology, if you like. Hegemony helps us to understand that power in society is maintained through the process of struggle, so it's not one way. Dominant and subordinate groups negotiate for who maintains power and who gets the rewards from that. Most of what you will read or see in mainstream media, not all but most, we would argue is hegemonic. It serves to maintain the status quo. It serves to maintain this notion of democracy or this notion of monarchy. It very rarely introduces ideas that are counter to the current cultural structures and main or dominant discourses. But there is this thing called kind of counter-hegemony. These are the discourses and the forms of communication that offer a counter-ideological perspective. Counter-hegemony refers to texts, ideas and activities that challenge or that counter the status quo. They challenge the dominant worldview. Some of those organisations that I mentioned a little earlier, Black Lives Matter, challenge the dominant ideology that white is superior to black or to other colours and races. Feminism has challenged the notion that males are more powerful and more important than females. And the Occupy movement challenges the notion of capitalism and ownership and individual ownership, etc. So these are counter-hegemonic movements, and there are texts associated with these as well. And counter-hegemonic activities can introduce new discourses and ideologies. New media has provided new spaces and ways to engage in struggles against hegemonic norms. So I don't know about you, but I get on my Facebook feed, I get some quite counter-hegemonic posts because I've liked things in the past, and they'll keep sending me some information, some memes, some comedy sketches, etc. that are counter-hegemonic. It's important to remember that more than one discourse or ideology can be present at any particular time in a text. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about something that happened several months ago. You may remember it, or you may not. You won't be able to find the original footage, by the way, because I've tried to find it to be able to present to you within this lecture. But a couple of months ago, on the Sunrise programme, that morning television programme, which is hosted by two middle-class white people who inevitably have a panel of other white middle-class people commenting on news and events and current affairs of the day. There was a discussion with three white non-Indigenous panellists, one of whom was a sports person, I understand, on whether or not Indigenous children should or should not be adopted out to non-Indigenous families. And I think you can probably tell by my tone and the very fact that I've selected this for discussion, I was concerned with that discussion for a number of reasons. I was concerned because these were not Indigenous people talking about Indigenous affairs. These were white people of non-Indigenous background talking about what should or should not happen in Aboriginal communities and within Aboriginal families. And there was an outcry, as you can imagine. There was a lot of protest against this dominant ideology of superiority that was being presented. And like I said, I've tried to find the actual original Sunrise debate or panel discussion. It's since been taken down conveniently. But what I want to show you now, and I've got some links, so I won't. So these will be embedded into this video. What I want to show you now are some counter-hegemonic responses to that. So just have a look at these now for the next couple of minutes. Some of them are a little bit long, so you can pause, you can make yourself a cup of tea, whatever, but do come back and watch them, because these are a classic example of what counter-hegemony is. These critique the dominant ideologies, and we'll talk about them once you've watched them. So they're quite funny, aren't they? Okay, so counter-hegemony is where the discourse and ideology or ideologies that are counter to the main dominant discourse and the main dominant ideology are represented. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background to Banksy before I show you some of his work as well. Most of you know who he is. He's an artist, yeah. He has an international reputation, although he's anonymous. Despite the surveillance society that we have, we've not yet managed to capture him. He's prolific in his creation of subversive art that questions or queries those dominant ideologies and hegemony. So he creates subversive art in public spaces. He's been doing this since the 1990s. He started in Bristol in the UK, but he now works internationally. And he's been quite mainstream, or most people have known about him since the year kind of 2000 or in the 2000s. His disruptive counter-hegemonic street graffiti works are often illegally painted on walls, on bridges, in and on refugee camps, and in urban streets. So it's a public display of counter-hegemony. The themes that he works with tend to be around anti-establishment and anti-established kind of capital, anti-capitalism, etc. He critiques war, he critiques poverty, the treatment of refugees, consumerism, etc. Consistent in his work are representation of rats, often representing the British royal family or politicians or people in positions of power and authority in that way. So if you have a look at the slide that has background Banksy on it, you'll see that there's a piece of art there where he's basically ridiculing why wealthy people, who he ridicules, he's ridiculing this obscene distribution of wealth, where some people have so much wealth that they will never be able to spend it in 10 lifetimes, and some people are incredibly impoverished. So he critiques consumerism and capitalism and the accumulation of extreme wealth in that way. And yet people are buying up, these very, very wealthy people are buying up his artwork. So he's kind of satirizing that in that image, which is quite funny. And now we're going to just leave the last slide of the lecture, and I'm going to leave it to you to deconstruct according to what ideologies you think are in there, what hegemony or counter-hegemony you think is presented. It is a Banksy image. On the right you'll see that there's Ronald McDonald smiling and waving, and you might think of the representations there. What does Ronald McDonald represent? And then on the left you've got Mickey Mouse, and again, what corporation, what ideologies does Disney represent? And in the centre, holding the hands, is another iconic symbol. So these are three icons, if you like. And this is the Napalm Girl that most of you will be familiar with from the war in Vietnam. And the juxtaposition, the placing next to one another of examples of privilege, of elitism, of consumerism, of capitalism, of extreme wealth, with incredible poverty and with war, that would and could arguably be said that it was supported and financed by these other two notions of capitalism and consumerism, etc., offers a really interesting political statement. This, one would argue then, is a visual piece of counter-hegemony. So I'm hoping that today you've got your head around what those main ideas are, around ideology, around dominant ideologies, around discourse, and around hegemony and counter-hegemony. We're going to work through these ideas now in tutorials this week and continue to do so over the next couple of weeks. Thank you for bearing with me through this electronic medium today. I'll be back as normal next week in the lecture theatre, so 8 till 9 next Wednesday. Keep on top of your reading, look at your slides, come into next week's lecture with any questions that you might have about this week's lecture. Okay, thanks. See you soon. Bye.